Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to commence with the final hour. And up for you today, we have Chris Culbert, along with Kathy Larini and Brian Wilcox as the facilitators for the synergies with Moon and Mars, or as Clive would say, Neo Prime and Mars.
You know, we happily added Phobos and Deimos as Neo Prime 2 and 3, I think. All right, so this was a very passionate group with a lot of interesting ideas. We got into a little bit of an engineers versus scientists discussion, which was quite interesting. I want to thank our facilitators for somehow scrambling to keep up with all the information flying around the room and doing a very good job of capturing that. And the rest of the team for bringing a lot of energy to the discussion. It was actually very interesting. Let's go. So I'm going to start with a little bit of an outline of some of the key points. We ended up with some very diverse thinking about the right way to frame these questions. So I'm going to start kind of laying out some of the key points, first from a Moon Neo perspective, then from a Mars and a Neo perspective. There are obviously some characteristics, where when you compare human missions to the Moon and human missions to Mars, things like EVA dust mitigation. Both of them have to deal with that, but it's possible the NEO may have a worse environment. Sample acquisition, storage, handling, all the types of in situ analysis or things you might do to high grade or triage these samples have some commonality. Teleoperation robotic systems with real-time control. In other words, the robots in the local environment being able to control robots that facilitate activities for the humans or do activities by themselves. Both involve highly active mission operations. By that, what we mean is that both Moon and NEO missions have a period of transit there, then an intense period of activity. For the purposes of today's discussion, we use shorter duration lunar missions, 14 to 30 days, which would be about the framework we're talking about for a NEO mission for humans, which is going to give you a very dense, highly packed activity timeline for the crew to work through. So we want to minimize the amount of time the crew spends on doing housekeeping, preventive maintenance, preparations. They want to be able to spend most of their time on doing the mission. The capabilities for accomplishing science have a lot of similarity. The places you apply them may not, but the types of activities and the types of questions you're answering from a science perspective, there will be some which have a fair amount of similarity. The ops model, the ability to get out and go do things, get back in and go to another location and do it again will be very important. The way you do that will be very different on the Moon than it would be on a NEO. But the operations philosophy itself isn't necessarily very different. And some of the underlying system models that you need to apply, ECLS systems, thermal shielding, radiation shielding, so on, clearly have a lot of applicability. All right, now let's turn to the Mars a little bit. Now, as we got into the Mars discussion, we started talking a little more holistic, if you will, the end-to-end mission profile, and considering what that might mean. So we wanted to start putting a little more of attention on the synergies on those systems that have high cost. Obviously, recognizing that the NEO missions represent a very important opportunity for Mars. We can drive out things we want to do to prepare for our Mars missions by testing them on a NEO mission. And that led that table to some interesting conclusions about things we should do before we can go to Mars, and I'll come back to that. And we also wanted to recognize that it's very important for these scale of missions to have strong international engagement very early in the discussion. Then they took and broke it down into some of the phases of the mission, if you will, a little bit. Launch, for example. It's important to use similar systems, such as heavy lift propellants and depots. And we come down to the nuclear. The transit phase itself, your transit hab, clearly an opportunity for demonstrating some of those capabilities on ISS, and that should be taken advantage of. That also brings international partnership discussion to the table very early, which was consistent with the philosophy expressed earlier. Your cargo logistics storage, in-space propulsion, launch window sensitivities, crew support, radiation and monitoring and protection, you can test those early, and you want to prove that those work right before you have very long missions to Mars. And then nuclear power. This table got to the point where they actually strongly believe we should wait on a NEO mission till we had nuclear power, because that's a key element to taking us to Mars. And if we want to test things right, let's have that in hand for our NEO mission as well. Even if you don't have to have it for the NEO mission, maybe you should wait till it's ready. Well, I'm sure we'll get some comments about that. Once you get to the surface of the Moon or Mars, or moons in this case, because we kept the Phobos and Deimos into the discussion. Surface access to Phobos and Deimos doesn't create anywhere near the kind of gravity well issues that going down to the surface of Mars, and in fact, it's a lot like rendezvousing with a NEO. Your science equipment will have a lot of commonality. You have now the opportunity to talk about ISRU. There are even some interesting discussions about ISRU activities you might be able to perform on Phobos and Deimos. And once you've reached that discussion, your operations concept, we're going to have a lot of similarity. And you can demonstrate things at the NEO that you might use at either Mars itself while you're in orbit or at the Mars moons. If you go all the way down to the surface of Mars, you're going to have a lot of commonality with some of the science activities, but it's going to be a little different. And then we looked at things where, whether you're going to the surface of Mars, whether you're orbiting and dealing with the moons of Mars, the nuclear power that provides your power infrastructure, both on the way there and potentially while you're at your location, telerobotics, autonomous operations. Remember, by this point in time, interactions with Earth are at the end of a fairly substantial time delay. Even some of the NEO missions would take us to time delays that make it impractical for ground control to operate or control the systems, and you have to have a lot more autonomy to keep that operations burden off the crew so they can focus on the mission. The communications, navigation software, all those things come into play. And then finally, particularly for Mars missions, re-entry. The velocities for crew re-entry give you the opportunity to couple some of those techniques or approaches together. All right, so let's talk a little more about Moon-NEO commonalities, not so much now from the holistic perspective, more from the actual activities for the crew perspective, if you will. So the first grouping was all associated with keeping humans alive. We already covered most of this, but radiation shielding mitigation, dust mitigation. Both moons and NEOs are dealing with vacuum environments. Your life support infrastructure, keeping the crew alive, the food, the water, the oxygen, the waste management, all those kinds of things can have a lot of commonality. Medical, the ability for the crew to handle medical emergencies without relying upon ground infrastructure support will be common. And then we talked about a class of activities associated with keeping humans productive. Dust mitigation shows up here again. Now it's more from the standpoint of making sure your suits and your teleoperated robotic systems and all your other systems are capable of continuing to operate despite the lusty environment. Your robotic tools to support them, your ability to sample whatever you want to capture, do things with it. Mobility through the environment. Again, the type of mobility is very different on the moon versus at a NEO. But the opportunity to move around the environment to get to the next place you want to either gather samples from or emplace instruments or do something interesting would be important. I've already covered, psychological aspects. Both of those could represent missions of a long enough duration to start letting you understand the ramifications of having small crews of people work in fairly tight environments over reasonably interesting spans of time. And doing that properly there's a whole science associated with that, and it gets into play here. Autonomous operations, I've mentioned, sampling. There's a variety of types of sampling that are important in the science community. Subsurface, the ability to curate those things in the right way, particularly if you're dealing with ices or other things that require cryogenic storage. The ConOps team already mentioned the thing we talked about, the ability to train them properly, either on the way there or once they're there to do it right so that they're handling those samples in the right way. And acquiring the samples and doing the selection of what you care about, what's interesting is important. I mentioned the human training again, instrument deployment, that's all fits into those same discussions. Now let's talk about Mars and NEO commonalities. So we created that moon version first, and now we're going to use that same template for a Mars version. It looks similar, but there's some important differences here. We still have radiation, dust, life support, medical, those kinds of things apply in very similar ways. The duration gets different, but the core technology needs and system needs are very similar. We changed it from vacuum now to non-breathable atmospheres. One is a vacuum, one has you still can't use the atmosphere in a useful way for sustaining human health. I think most of what come under productivity was very similar. Again, the mobility is going to be different. Psychological aspects come more into play because you're dealing even longer duration missions. Autonomous ops, sampling, human training, all those things are largely the same as Moon and Mars. So the comparison between NEO missions to Moon and NEO missions to Mars, from this standpoint, had a lot of commonality, a lot of synergy. Some of that shows up in your system, but a lot of it shows up in your mission operations and the way you plan the missions and perform them. We also tried to capture what things were different between them, because that helps you get an understanding of what you have to plan for so one of the things we tried to capture effectively was the idea that if you know you're going to perform these other missions, you ought to be designing your NEO mission to accommodate what you're going to do at those other locations as well. So that means knowing what's different is very important to you. Obviously, gravity fields are very different between Moon and NEO, and you'll see that again in the Mars. The ability to abort your missions is very different, particularly in the lunar missions. On most lunar profiles we've looked at, you have the ability to come home within just a couple days, which has a big effect on how you deal with certain types of medical emergencies and the type of redundancies and contingencies you have to be able to handle by the crew in situ. When you're talking about keeping the humans productive, the scale of mobility is both different and very important. In a NEO environment, you're talking about moving maybe, as Mike's team called it, the MMSEV around for just a few meters, at most a few kilometers. When you're talking about lunar surfaces, you're talking tens of kilometers to hundreds of kilometers. So that has ramifications to how you design those systems and how they'll be used. Again, obviously, gravity comes into play. Autonomous operations. On Moon, the ability for Earth ground support to provide active real-time interaction with the crew or even control reduces your requirement for autonomous operations. We'll see that's different in the next chart when we talk about Mars. And the effect of gravity upon the samples you care about is important to the geologist in understanding what it means. So you have to be more aware of where you took it and the context you took it under. All right, between Mars and NEOs, we came up with a somewhat longer list of differences. Radiation still shows up, and actually it isn't very different, other than the effect Mars, the body of Mars, and the atmosphere you're living within have on the exposure to radiation. There are likely to be some differences there than dealing with a vacuum environment. I don't think that's very well understood yet, but it's worth noting that they could be different. Once you get into this atmosphere of Mars, that atmosphere will have an effect on dust. From one extreme, the ability of dust storms to create environments for dust that are very, very bad for your systems, your potential crew members. To the other end of the extreme, when you're walking around or driving around kicking up dust, the atmosphere will have an effect on how that dust settles and where it might go. Also, Mars is an environment where we know we care about planetary protection. So we have to be aware of the potentially biologically hazardous effects of Martian dust on the humans and our interactions on it. We'll come to that a little more before the end of the chart. Life support systems at Mars, we have the opportunity to talk about using the atmosphere as a part of our ISRU capabilities and utilizing elements of that atmosphere to support humans. Because of the ability to use ISRU and the longer duration of the missions, the ability to pre-place your systems might be very important. Medical looks very similar, though, again, for somewhat longer duration. In the human productivity side of things, let me just call out the wear and tear, not just on your robotic tools, but on all your systems. You're asking them to live for a longer span of time. They're going to be used more. They're living in both an atmospheric environment and a dust environment. You're likely to have some differences in how you design the systems to be able to handle those life cycles. Many of the tools you use on Mars would end up being somewhat different because you're in a gravity environment and your atmospheric environment than the ones you could use at a NEO. We already mentioned under Moon gravity effects, the mobility effects. Only thing to note on Mars, we're going to be there an even longer span of time. It's a larger planetary body. Now we're talking about mobility systems that have to have the ability to affect not just hundreds of kilometers, but potentially thousands of kilometers of range. And planetary protection is a very important discussion on Mars. It's less important on the Moon, less important on NEOs, but once you go to Mars, planetary protection both ways. Forward planetary protection as well as backward contamination are of high importance to both design and the architecture from day one. And you probably don't have to deal with very much of that on a NEO. And what that means to the samples. We know we want to protect the samples we can bring back in every environment, but how you capture them properly and grade which ones you care about on Mars might be very important because of the planetary protection aspects. We had listed a set of systems for human exploration, and we discussed some of those. Actually, you've seen those really in the charts we went through and how some of those show up. We are preparing a whole matrix which kind of lists all those things against Mars, Moon, and NEO. We just don't have that done yet, but that'll go in the final product from this set, is that matrix of information, essentially taking all that data that we now have in Word form and kind of racking it up and racking and stacking a little more easy to read and understand form. We just didn't get that done for today. I think that's the overview of the material.
Okay, perfect. Very good. We'll now open it up for questions and comments or inputs.
The Mars transit and the NEO transit are very, very close missions in terms of similarity, except for maybe duration. And I think your discussion was kind of Mars together with the surface combined. But I think if the more we do in terms of making the NEO mission transit system close to Mars, the farther and closer, the closer we'll be to getting to the Mars destination after that. You know.
Yeah, we did note, transit had it as its own line item, and clearly we saw a lot of commonality between life support and the transit there, as NEOs and Mars. Once you get to the surface, you have the opportunity to start talking about how ISRU could benefit your life support discussions, and you would have to take that into account, and that might drive some of your commonality across transit versus surface.
But if I could add, we talked, I think Marcello Cordini introduced the concept yesterday, but the sending humans to NEOs, the objectives will touch three main stakeholder groups, right? We were talking about them, the deep space exploration, advancing those concepts, the planetary defense, and science. And where we got to, a lot of our discussion centered around, you really need to use the NEO mission, and especially transit aspects of it, as a precursor or as a technology demonstration, a readiness exercise assessment for Mars. And so that led us to think that the timing of a human NEO mission should coincide with your readiness to demonstrate some of these key technologies that you would need for the transit time. So I think that's what you're pulling on, and we as a group felt that was really a logical approach. Our table anyway.
Okay. Tom.
I'm glad that you brought up nuclear power. Tom Jones, by the way. Glad you brought up nuclear power. It has a lot of appeal in terms of mission robustness, and having a power-rich environment means a safer environment for the crew to have all of that extra juice. And did you guys discuss, a preference for nuclear power just as an electrical power source, or for nuclear propulsion? Did you have a variety or a flavor of nuclear power that you thought you were focusing in on? It seems to me that even 20 years ago, we talked about how in the discussions of the SEI that a NEO mission would be a good way to shake down a nuclear propulsion system before you go off to more ambitious destinations like Mars or the Martian moons. So is that the way you're thinking, is that this is a good way to get the system wrung out?
Yes, for both the power to run the lights in the computers, as well as the propulsion.
And is there any serious discussion about how you get from here today in 2010 to that capability?
We just recognized that it seemed incompatible with the nuclear power development roadmaps that exist today, 2025, and the roadmaps that exist today. We just noted that.
Good observation.
Peter.
So on a less ambitious note than using nuclear, I was struck by the possibility that if you're looking at the Martian moons, that the same sorts of precursor design missions, you might be able to design one spacecraft and build 3 or 4 or 5 of them, depending on what your NEO targets would be, with very similar sorts of capabilities to do that. And the same thing for any kind of prepositioning as well, that a solar electric tug could be used across all of those different mission sets.
Well, I chaired I facilitated the table that had most of the scientists. I'm not myself a scientist, however. We avoided the Deimos and Phobos issue pretty much. We focused almost entirely on a 300-day class stay time on the Mars surface. And, my own personal view, and I suspect the view of many of the people at my table, is that the Deimos and Phobos are very close to Neo and are almost, Neo Prime 1 and Neo Prime 2. And so really the issues in the Deimos and Phobos missions are very similar to the other Neo missions, except that the transit time is more like the Mars mission.
Hi, Bill Larson, NASA. Chris, you had some charts up there on similarities, differences of the different missions, and their synergies with Mars. And I understand completely how you came to the conclusion on ISRU about atmospheric ISRU. We've got DRMs out there that basically rely on Mars atmospheric ISRU. But that was before we started talking about doing missions to NEOs. And as we've talked about, Phobos and Deimos are NEO-class type objects. And I think it's a little too early to say that we would only do atmospheric ISRU. If we went to Phobos or Deimos, we could set up propellant depots there just as well as we could on the surface of Mars. And so then you would have a similarity. So my only quibble is that you had the differences as being, that there was nothing about a NEO ISRU mission that would be similar to Mars. And I think it's too early to close down that trade space would just be my comment.
I don't think we intended to exclude it per se.
Yes, sir.
Brad Blair, Colorado School of Mines. If I step up, then there's more feedback or less? I'm scared of this thing. I like my ears. I guess I would like to ask if anybody has looked into the amount of risk, mission risk, that's brought down by pre-deploying an ISRU capability in terms of creating a cache of consumables and or propellant in case of something like an Apollo 8, or excuse me, an Apollo 13 type of accident where they lost one of their fuel cells, or in case of loss of other capabilities, oxygen supply, propellant.
Well, that was not discussed certainly at my table, but certainly many mission concepts have assumed pre-deployment of assets on the surface, and that you wouldn't launch the humans to Mars until and unless you had validation that the pre-deployed assets were there, and that you, if it involved ISRU propellant, that you probably had to also have validation that the propellant was mostly or even completely in the tanks on the surface before you launched humans.
We didn't. Our doctors didn't get to the kind of risk associated with that and how you might translate that into decisions about your missions because of risk reduction. We didn't get into that really.
Go ahead. So, John Makins, just an observation. The assessment during the last day on the question of synergies has focused on the Moon, NEOs, and Mars. However, I think in looking at a NEO initiative and NEO investments in advanced technology, et cetera, that looking at the prospective synergies of NEO missions across a wide range of other science exploration, commercial, and national security applications makes a huge amount of sense. Because if you think about huge new telescopes, post-Jim Webb, terrestrial planet imager, terrestrial planet finder before that, ambitious outer planet missions, their delta V requirements, and so on, if you limit yourself to just these three balls in the air, you kind of say it's the human spaceflight program against the rest. Whereas if you look at these future space capabilities in the context of all these other ambitious things we want to do during the next 20, 30 years, suddenly the human space exploration investments become enabling, perhaps, for all these other ambitious things, and that's the right story.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Yeah, as you build up these capabilities, you are enabling a wide variety of other types of missions, too, and that's a very valuable story. I agree.
That sort of touches on a sustainability discussion that we had at my table. The discussion went something like this. if we mount a human mission to a NEO, and we aren't where we want to be with respect to the robustness of the capabilities in the systems, we end up having to bring more spares, having to do things that create an unsustainable perception of the human spaceflight program. So when we're going to take these next steps to go to a NEO, we better make sure we can do it in a sustainable way, have the capability to go there with robust systems that are, push the least amount of mass possible, have confidence in the capabilities that we have, and that gives us that by default gives us the capabilities to go other places, probably. It gives us the confidence in you're not making big changes, reworking big things to go here, or go somewhere else like that. So it was a very important element for the people at my table, was making sure that when we did go, we were confident in our capabilities and the sustainability of the end-to-end system, so that we would enable those other missions to the next places, the follow-on places.
Last question.
There have been several comments to the effect that we should essentially wait until we're ready to do a NEO mission the way we would do a Mars mission. You mentioned the nuclear power option. One of the attractions of a NEO mission or an asteroid mission is you can do it a lot more easily than a Mars mission. And if we wait to do it the same way, we will do it about the same time, which is not for a very long time from now. But asteroids also give you the opportunity to incrementally work your way into that level of difficulty. So did you talk at all about time phasing of, can you start with a mission that has essentially no new technology, and which technologies would you add first? Closed loop life support, and then advanced propulsion, and then a few years later higher speed reentry capability, and so on?
Not really. It's a fair question to ask. It's something that, it's a way to look at the problem that should be pursued. I think what we did feel strongly, though, is to go without taking the opportunity to use the missions to demonstrate, a subset of the key technologies, or those certain key technologies for Mars that were very important, key capabilities for Mars that were very important, would be a mistake. So to start out with your first mission doing it with the existing capabilities that we have today, I don't think people at my table would have supported an idea like that. You need to be sure we discussed folding in some advanced capabilities and demonstrating them. Does it have to be all of them? Of course not.
Yeah, let's answer the other half of that question. He's right. Clearly, we can create missions to NEOs that are a more staged sequence of steps. There's a minimum set of capabilities you must have to be able to send humans there and bring them back safely. But he's right. You don't have to be all the ones you need to go all the way to Mars and bring them back safely. And there's a useful discussion to be had about when you decide to make that mission choice. I would argue it's not as much a technical discussion as it is a financial and a agency goals or national interests type discussion than technical.
Okay, thank you very much. That was another outstanding panel. If you guys want to just grab it. So next up we have. Last but certainly not least, I sat in, they had a very vibrant discussion as well. Gail Allen led our policy sub-team, and so they will be up next. While we're waiting for them to come up and join us, I'll move up here. A little public service announcement. We have been web streaming this live, and just thought I'd give you a couple of stats from yesterday. We had 850 folks with 103 concurrent viewers, so that's pretty darn good given that there's about 150 or so of us here in person. We had 10 countries dialing in, which includes the United States, Russia, China, United Kingdom, Czech Republic, Germany, Netherlands, Ukraine, Canada, and Japan. So I also want to make sure that you know we're still taking inputs all the way through Friday from the public at large, as well as from any and all of you, should you so desire. So we're trying to make this really transparent, open, and inclusive, and thanks very much for using those microphones. Thus far, the feedback has been very positive, and so without further ado, Gail Allen.
Okay, so this time we get to pull up the rear. First, I want to say, number one, we had 2 topics, so I'm going to touch on both of those. But first, I want to say, I want to give kudos to our contact capturers for coming back today after the marathon event we had yesterday. But thank you, Jennifer Wiles and Nicole Herman. You've done a great job both days. So policy and participatory exploration were the 2 areas that we touched on, and we only had 3 questions, 2 for the policy area and 1 for the public engagement or participatory exploration. So the first question that we tackled this morning was what steps can be taken to ensure policy stability or sustainability for long periods of time. And as you all know, we have a new space policy fresh out in the last couple of months. And so we started out with the given. We're going to do international cooperation. It's going to be civil, peaceful missions that we conduct in space, and we're not in a race. So those were givens. Based on that, we wanted to delve a little bit deeper into what is the policy that is required to sustain human space flight. And with that, we had a couple of questions that we needed to ask. One of the things that Scott mentioned early when we started out today were, we need to have some questions. What are we trying to answer by going to any destination? What are the answers? What are the questions we need to answer? Is it for? It could be for scientific and engineering needs. It could be for economic needs. It could be for safety requirements when we're talking about planetary defense. But what is it that we're trying to accomplish so that then we can build the programs around that? And some of the questions are, can humans thrive beyond low Earth orbit? That is, can we go beyond low Earth orbit? One, can we live off the land? Are we trying to define that by the engineering capabilities? If we do, and there happen to be valuable resources that we might want to collect, can we live off the land and sustain ourselves that way? The analogy was, other than that, do we go for some period of time and then come back, for example, like an oil platform? Or do we have to go, or is our intent just to go to a certain place, plant the flag, and come back, and that's it? So those are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves and then build the case around it. The second one, it could be the economic benefits. Do we think that there are resources out in space that we could actually use to our advantage from an economic benefit? If so, that could be a compelling reason for us to go. And I wanted to add one third one to this, and in that it would be the planetary defense. We don't know enough, as we found out in these last 2 days, about what we need to do for mitigation for planetary defense in order to be able to determine whether we need a human to participate in that. So one of the things we need to ask ourselves is if and when we get some idea of what we need to do in a plan, will humans be in that mix? The next thing that we needed to look at was, or need to address, is the mixed strategy approach. One of the things we don't have that a lot of the other communities do, we don't have a human spaceflight community of stakeholders. Not ones that have integrated and banded together to help us. So once we get our questions identified, we need to really look at the potential of gathering our stakeholder community around the question to help support us in that and to help plan and develop the strategy that we need to go forward to accomplish answering that question. And last of all, we need achievable milestones. And one of the things that we've done, no matter how well we do something, or try to do something, meet our missions and develop our programs and execute them, we have lost some credibility along the way, whether it's the fact that we're overly optimistic, whatever the deal is, budget or whatever, we seem to not be able to complete the steps in the program and project that we'd like to complete. Therefore, we really need to look at realistically putting a plan around the project around a plan and being able to develop it where it's logical and sustainable. So for the barriers and gaps, we looked at, for a NEO emission, we split it with two barriers. And from an economic perspective, one of the things we discussed was, suppose we do find out all of the robotic missions that are going out there and characterizing all of the asteroids, and we find out that some of them are just rich in some resources that we could really justify going and bringing back. We have limited ourselves in some respects because we have signed a number of agreements, international agreements, about who and how you will mine any resources on the surface of any body in space. So we have to balance the fact that if we use economic expansion as part of our justification, we need to make sure that when we get there, we actually can do something that is economically feasible. The next barrier that and these, again, we have a number of them, and I'm sure they'll be published, but these were our top ones in our sessions. The second barrier that we identified was the uncertainty and questions and means driving the policy to go beyond low Earth orbit. And the discussion we had at that point was, without a clear set of questions or something that we can rally everyone around to understand why we're doing this, it's difficult to get humans to go to NEOs or any other body in space. We just need to have some plan around a set of what we're trying to accomplish to be able to do that. One of the discussion points today was the fact that going to a NEO is great, but we need to put it in the context, and you heard that a little bit earlier today, in the context of what does it mean in the big scheme of things? Do we want to do the one-offs, or do we want to use this as a building capability to go further or do other things? Again, from yesterday, the issue with how do we determine which NEO to go to, and if so, how do we know that the precursor missions have given us the information we need to be able to send humans there safely. From the gaps, we have no definitive leadership in the planetary defense. Now, we did hear yesterday that there are efforts ongoing about trying to get an international plan or even a national plan together. So if we were going back to one of our questions, if we were going to do this for planetary defense safety to our Earth, we really need to get some plan in place to be able to put the effort and the plan and program together to accomplish that with humans. Lastly, the lacking of development documentation. One of the things that we thought that is that we really don't have, again, reasons why we're going. We just know we're going. So maybe it's good to, and I think part of what we've done in those last 2 days is put us next step further in determining what those objectives and architecture should be. We got I was impressed with the breakout session on the concept of operations and the technologies, because they've gone really giant leaps these 2 days in putting that kind of information together. And that'll be useful when we try to back up and see what the bigger picture is on how this all fits together. The third question we had was in public engagement. And there was a lot of discussion here on this, but I don't know if we really ever got to some, endpoint continuity, I should say. We have looked at it very similarly to what Bruce did this morning, talking about the pyramid that he had on degrees of participation. We've looked at it as 5 phases, and we've been working on this now since the authorization language in the 2008 authorization bill, on where it Congress told us to build a participatory exploration plan for NASA. So we've been looking at this, and we've developed the 5 degrees of public engagement. The left-hand side being information dissemination, having information on a website or going out to public venues, all the way to the 5th degree, which was the public participatory exploration, which meant full collaboration, where we're actually having not only scientists but general public collecting data for us and feeding it back, and we're actually using that in analysis and that type of thing. We definitely would like to shift our focus more to the public, the collaboration and the iterative back and forth activities. And so that's one of the things that we're focusing on. I wanted to comment that we are having a participatory exploration workshop at the end of September. Kathy Nato is... Oh, she just stepped out. Okay, but she, see her or me, she's leading that effort. And what we're going to do is try to get companies and other federal agencies and just a general cross-cutting section of folks that can help us maybe come up with some ideas on how we can engage the public. But a couple of things that did come out that were recurring themes in this particular part of the discussion, and that says make the contact real. You know, we're beyond the two-dimensional, you know, see it on a screen. As someone mentioned in our session, Avatar. Once Avatar came out, you know, all things in the past are over, and we really need to get to the point where we can actually engage public, even if that's on the dissemination, information dissemination, because that's what gets people's attention. And then from the participatory exploration side of the house, people want to do real work and meaningful work, and one of the things was the stardust, where I think it was a third grade teacher that actually collected and identified stardust in one of the missions, and just by taking a slice out of the data and evaluating that. Those are the kinds of things, examples of how we would like to get people more engaged in what we're doing. And lastly, we put this on there. I mean, this one kind of struck me. Several people commented on this, the shift to focus from promoting study and you can become an astronaut, which is, you know, we were talking at length about STEM education and trying to get folks to stay in school and do math and engineering and to do great things in NASA. But if we really want to get the general public engaged, maybe we should shift it to come with us and explore the universe type of an approach, where we make it exciting and we don't limit it, although we want to still keep, obviously, our scientists and engineering focus on trying to keep kids in school and to become good scientists and engineers. If we really want to broaden this to the public, we really need to look at it from that perspective. And lastly, we did have one parking lot discussion, and I thought what was interesting about this, and I'll just read it, as a government, we should talk about space strategically, bring the public into everything without stovepiping. And so the question was, why don't we have a space channel, a government space channel, and include anything we can from DOD, from other agencies, and not have a NASA channel. And then, you know, there was discussion, should we have two, and have a NASA channel and the general exploration channel? Maybe it would be competitive in a good way. You know, anything we could do, but that was a very interesting thing. We do tend to put a lot of focus on the STEM education, which is extremely important, but when we need to step back about, you know, several thousand feet and say, where can we get the bang for buck to get the folks, the general public, involved? So that was just food for thought. And with that, I think that's it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Another outstanding overview. We'll open up the floor to questions, comments, inputs, and I can imagine, given that we have the policy group, a little debate would probably be fun to watch, too.
It's all his.
Mark Sykes, Planetary Science Institute. I think it's really appropriate to have this last because we've been looking at the cart earlier today. Here's the horse. And it exemplifies what this whole exercise has been, the cart before the horse. It's difficult to flesh out all these various objectives in the absence of a policy context. And the policy is something which, frankly, has to come from the administration. It's not going to be coming out of NASA studies. And it has a huge impact on how we prioritize things, what activities we want to be focusing on, and it also, frankly, a lot of the activities that we're tossing up there on the board, particularly in science and planetary protection, could be more cost-effectively done robotically. And so we need to know what we're doing. And if we were to have a context like Lori was saying the other day, with the expanding humans beyond low Earth orbit, you know, into the solar system, you know, then we look at something like going to NEOs and say, that may be an essential part of establishing of self-sustaining space transportation infrastructure, which would give us access to the moon, to Mars, to other locations once we get up to low Earth orbit. It provides a necessary, I would say, context. So, but I don't see the path where how, if there's no discussion in the administration beyond what's been promulgated in the national space policy or by speech by the president, how that policy is going to come about, and how it's going to come out of the mouth of the president to give real guidance to these future efforts.
Okay, I mean, I'd like to both, I guess, a typical policy answer. I'll both agree and disagree. With this, I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of, which is the horse and sort of which is the cart, in terms of what questions are we answering. And one of the discussions, and one of my particular hobby horses, is to stress that when Kennedy made the decision to go to the moon, it wasn't because he was a space cadet. Is because he had a very serious political problem at that point in time, and sending a man to the moon in a decade, come back safely, was an answer to a political question that he had. Now, of course, a lot of us in the space community, of which I include myself, the answer is human spaceflight. What was the question? And so we need, I think, to back up and ask what questions are we answering with human spaceflight as opposed to having, the answer already in place.
I just wanted to comment that this is an exercise I've seen for decades, where we don't have a reason for doing what we want to do. So we come up with a whole list of things in a variety of categories and say, given that we're going to do this, here's all the things we can accomplish. And then that becomes the reason for doing it. And whether or not that's the best way of actually achieving the goals laid out. And I think that when you do it that way, it's difficult to support to the appropriators, and you get programs canceled, like going to the moon, or going back to the moon twice, right? Bush 1, Bush 2. So there needs we do need to get that horse in front of the cart.
Well, and I think this is where I'm probably a little bit more optimistic on something, and I've got the scars and the T-shirt from both previous efforts. And that is, I look at what the science community does in the decadal surveys, and they ask very profound questions for which even congressional staffers can understand the questions, and that they then chained into a very complex program of answering those questions that lead you down to times and schedules and so forth. And I think the question for the human spaceflight community is, what questions are we asking? To which doing things like looking at in-situ resource utilization or commercial opportunities or long flights beyond low Earth orbit are potential answers to that. And so what I'm suggesting is actually the human spaceflight community in general needs to be thinking about a decadal survey of its own, because frankly commissions, presidential and otherwise, happen to the community every 10 years anyway. It might as well put it on a normal schedule. We don't change and decide whether or not we're going to have an astrophysics program or a heliophysics program every time we have an election. Yet we seem to do that with our human spaceflight community with some regularity. Now, the part where I'm optimistic is when I look at the categories of things here, deep space exploration, planetary defense, and science. There's actually a fair amount of maturity in each of those areas. If I go in the planetary science community and I go to the small bodies group, there's a fairly robust international discussion about what things people want to know. The planetary defense community, there's a fairly emerging strong consensus about detection, characterization, mitigation, lots of details to argue and fight about. But that also is merging, and I can get documentation there. Human spaceflight, not so much. And that's one of the, I think, key areas of weaknesses, is coming up with, well, what's the architecture and what are the priority questions we're trying to answer with human spaceflight so we can put a human NEO mission in a broader context so it doesn't risk becoming a flags and footprints sort of exercise, but is actually as part of a longer-term effort going outward. And then I've got a whole longer answer, which I won't do right now, on linking these activities back to enduring national interests and values, international values, security values, scientific and economic, that are going to endure whether or not we have, no matter what party is in power or what president is in power, because they link to our broader national interests. And it's that kind of policy discussion and development that I think obviously still needs to go on.
Capabilities survive. Programs and architectures, there's a graveyard full of them. NLS, SLI, X-33, I think, shuttle and EELV are the only two survivors of, making a new launch system. And I guess the question is, where is the focus on buying down program risk? Because all of these programs their point of failure has not been in buying down the mission risk, which has been a tremendous investment. But if you don't have a survivable program, and really I want to answer that question with, I think it's really a function of marketing. You need to go out there and sell the next president that it's not necessarily a good idea to do what all the others have done. It's this sort of rite of passage for a new president to come in and push everything off the table and say, I want to do it my way.
Well, and I think that the answer to that is, to some extent, is to depoliticize the nature. I mean, human spaceflight in particular began and still is an incredibly emotionally fraught and symbolic activity. I mean, people being a member of the space club and all that. What countries we decide to cooperate with on International Space Station is both a political as well as a technical matter. And so you're not going to separate it from those backgrounds completely. But I think you can try to set out priorities, and I think it's incumbent upon the community to answer and lay out these questions. I mean, one of the reasons why the Congress actually likes decadal surveys is not because they understand them or read them. It's because the communities have gone and have fought among themselves and come up with priority questions that have to be answered. Then NASA is asked, within the amount of resources that they're allowed to have, which is decided by political means, as to how many of these questions can you afford. Now, there's a bunch of more questions than there ever is resources. But nonetheless, those priorities set by the community and then the programming put in by the agency is a fairly stable process. And where there are problems, say like overruns on MSL and James Webb, guess what? The damage happens to those communities first before it spreads outward. And so there's a sense of equity that, however painful it may be, people understand. And the Congress doesn't have to listen to scientists fighting among themselves because they know that the prioritization has already been done elsewhere. So that's why there's a degree of stability in those programs, despite all the pain, despite the new technologies, despite changing questions. That's a process that's much more stable than anything we've ever seen in human spaceflight.
Another corollary that gets you away from looking at the development of new launch vehicles is to look at the history of the Earth Observing Program at NASA in the early days and how that developed over time very quietly and in a very sustained manner. The second one is the Human Research Program, in which we work to not only understand the health and safety of astronauts, but also look at what the factors are that extend from that research into the broader medical and human factors community. So what you have there is an extended period of time in which it was non-political, non-politicized, and you have a stabilization that occurred in these programs. You have a currently understood research trajectory and a technology development trajectory that goes along with it. They are, for me, a better example of where we hope to go with this program than looking at previous launch vehicle programs.
Josh Hopkins, Lockheed Martin, with just a suggestion on public outreach. I started taking a tally at the beginning of the conference yesterday on how many times we used the acronym NEO and how many times we used the word asteroid, and we were running about 10-1 in favor of NEO when I stopped taking a tally, including in the title of the conference. And I speculate that if each of us were to ask a stranger on the metro tonight how they feel about NEOs, not one of us would get anything more than a puzzled look. I think if you explain what it stood for, you'd still get a puzzled look, especially if you had to explain that the moon isn't one. But when you eventually get to the point of explaining that NEO means asteroid, then people know what that is. They may think that the Millennium Falcon flies past asteroid fields and they've seen Armageddon, and maybe the grasp of it may not be very deep, but they have some idea what we're talking about. So I would suggest that we strike the acronym from our vocabulary, especially since it isn't particularly more accurate. We're not going to any class of near-Earth objects. We're specifically going to the asteroids and not the space debris and not the near-Earth comets. So it would not only be more helpful for the public, but also just as technically accurate, to use a real word.
Thank you. Heard.
Well, and of course, that will probably never happen within NASA, although I think it's an important point in communicating outward. But we all know that tribes like to have their own language, and so part of the way we identify other fellow tribe members is by how many acronyms we use. There's a course in anthropology here somewhere.
Can we compromise on near-Earth asteroid?
Okay.
National Education Association.
Well, one of the other things, in the spirit of being, again, glass half full, I also would point out that it was perfectly possible for the National Space Policy to have come out and said that we're not going beyond low Earth orbit. I mean, the 1996 Clinton policy said that, space station was kind of it. And we all know people in this room who went into the Mars underground and other things to look and study stuff despite that policy. So the fact that there is a policy which says we do want to look at going beyond Earth orbit, that we do want to do it in international cooperation, we do want to do it in a civil way. There is not a sort of existential political crisis. We're not racing anyone. Those are big foundations. And a lot of the justifications and reasons, somewhat cobbled together as cart before the horse, as was said, does have documentation and some material behind it. But again, I think the area that's really the weakest is in some of the human spaceflight rationale. And what questions are we trying to answer? I have a particular pet rock, as people here have heard, about answering the question, is there a human future beyond the Earth? And that's kind of like, is there intelligent life in the universe? The answer is either yes or no, and both answers are profound and interesting. People may believe and have faith and hopes that the answer is obviously yes. You run into people who think the answer is obviously no. But the purpose of exploration is to answer those questions, not to come up with revealed wisdom and attempt to find other converts. The point is to lay out those questions and get other people to see if they are willing to work with you on answering those questions.
And I would make one additional comment, or one closure, is we did receive very clear direction from the President, and we've had relatively amazing bipartisan engagement, both the authorizers and the appropriators, and we've had some extremely vigorous dialogue in Congress. And the amazing thing is we're not debating whether there's a human spaceflight program. We're debating what that should look like, and that's a fairly profound activity. We have the 5 global exploration strategy themes that do encapsulate, and we have 14 nations across the globe, the spacefaring agencies, saying, yes, we agree that those are common, valuable, tightly linked reasons to go do this. Those are the why. We've gotten a plus up, as we've mentioned, the national space policy. So I think if we look at it in aggregate, I think there are some really fertile opportunities here, and it's up to us to chart that course. Clive, final round.
All right. Just to try and encapsulate what I've heard, the question that comes out is, why do we send humans into space? We need to be able to answer that very succinctly so that the public and Congress understands the reasons for doing that. Not we're waiting for questions to go on. So there's fundamental reasons to send humans into space, to go explore, to push the frontiers back. You can make some... It's to make fundamental discoveries and extend human civilization. We can put all the big words into it, but trying to make that resonate in terms of the public, in terms of Congress, is going to be very difficult, and it's something that really needs to be tackled head on. And again, learning from the last time we did this, that wasn't tackled head on until late in the game, and here we are doing it again. So again, learning from history is a good thing. And the other thing is that this is a step into a bigger picture. We're going to asteroids. And we're going to asteroids. Why are we going to asteroids? It's part of a bigger step. It's to learn to explore the solar system. That's all very good, but there's a map here now. We're developing capabilities so we can go anywhere. It's a flexible path, isn't it? So we've got to start to get this message out and try and push on with it to get people on board to make this a sustainable program and not one that's dead in 2-3 years.
from my perspective, okay, as someone inside NASA who's also an anthropologist, okay, if you look at the top 10 policy responses that Americans make over the last 15, 20 years, there's a great deal of thou shalt and thou shalt nots. You know, we need to reduce crime, and we need to address ills in our society and things like that. But and these all correspond to value systems that are kind of generally held by the Americans. But the one thing that appears on about number 11 or 12, and sometimes 13, and sometimes back up to 10, is exploring space. Okay? It's a value. But when you articulate that, it's going to be an articulation by me, by you, by others, and it takes a very diverse form. This is not an apology for the lack of a clear definition. But what it is for some reason it's in there and it's inside us, and it's a value that we hold dearly. But maybe like mom, apple pie, and some other stuff, we may not be able to articulate it clearly. I agree with you there, but we may never come up with an answer, 7 words or less, to which everyone will respond in the same way.
With that, I see 2 folks standing, lightning round. Go ahead.
I just wanted to speak a little bit to the articulating the purpose of humans in space, because I think that, at least for somebody in my generation, who gets into the space program, you start by having the same kind of rah-rah flags and footprints, people going out, but the arguments, the fiscal arguments, the make sense arguments, seem to diminish over time as our virtual presence, as our robotic stuff goes on. That doesn't mean that somebody like me would not support a human spaceflight program, but it means that your goal that you're articulating has to be bigger, and it has to be directed towards having not just something vague like extending human presence. I want to have something very concrete like a sustainable colony in space that people live their entire life in, and see you working towards that. Because then that tells me what I'm doing with NEOs, what I'm doing with in-situ resource utilization, that drives all that. And then I expect the program to reflect that and not just be about exploration. It's about a vision for development and industrialization. That drives a very different sort, I think, in terms of sequencing and capabilities, priorities in your space program. Now, I realize others see it differently, but I do think that if you're going to co-opt those of us who think that space industrialization matters, you have to very, very clearly articulate that it's not something vague and small, that you're really talking about going big and making us ultimately a multi-habitat, multi-planetary civilization, and that we are actively building towards that.
Well, a quick response is, as someone who still has a very low L5 Society membership number, okay, I resonate with that. But I also have been in Washington long enough to recognize that I have to deal with lots and lots of people for whom that doesn't really grab them. They don't want America not to be in space. They like space exploration, but it doesn't grab them in the same way. And so what I've often done, and I don't know if this will work in every case, is to talk about, well, if people are going to be out there in space, space is globalizing, other countries are out there, China's flying, Russia's flying, that's great, wonderful, don't begrudge them, happy to see them out there, this is not a race. But that if other countries are going to be out there and exploring and seeing what they can do and where they can go, I would like my nation's values, mixed market economy, liberal democratic culture, free, relative attention to human rights, I want to make sure that those values are out there and that they should find a place where they can thrive. Now, maybe there will never be a colony out there, but if there is, I want to make sure that it reflects my values and things that I care about. And that's where I think you can start finding common ground with people. And you can find common ground with other countries who also share those same kind of democratic values and freedom values at a very, very gut level. And that's what we're doing. And we're trying to find out where that human society can go, not just our DNA, not just our machines, but our society and our values.
Final statement.
Final statement. Well, first, I'd have to disagree with Clive that I don't think that we have a flexible path. We have another in a series of terminal targets. And that if we cannot articulate where we're going and what we want to do it's because we can't articulate it clearly, it's because we're not thinking about it very clearly. And I think that Lieutenant Colonel has made a clear articulation about what he'd like to see, and I don't think that it's wrong to take up the challenge of finding out, is it possible? Do we have a future beyond Earth? A future in terms of living, working, dying beyond low Earth orbit? The future that we dreamed about in the 60s, that while we had a program that was motivated by beat the Soviets, the public was sold on this is the dawn of the space age where space was opening up for everybody. We have never, as a nation, undertook the challenge of asking and answering the question of is that possible? If it's not possible, like you were saying, that's a very important and critical piece of information to have. If it is possible, we have a door that we can choose to walk through if we wish at whatever speed we want.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent panel, really appreciate it.